Hey guys, I hope I would likely be here, though they didn't come today. But tomorrow, because they called me today, one of them I was like, "Oh, we're gonna be coming tomorrow," and I thought it was all three plus the dogs, and now I think it's just one. The other one's sick, maybe even not even the dogs. So that would be a lot easier. Because I was thinking, oh, I really have to clean this bed, and I was saying, this is why I've been taking more baths lately. I think that my back has been bothering me again because there's not really a way around waiting till you feel better. If it's like you have to clean this bed and you have to move this, and it's like I can't. I don't want to say like I can't put a limit on myself if someone tells me to do something, but it's kind of right. That's because it's not what you're putting on. By the way, I'm putting on these red boots because I just saw them in the bed and I thought Terry might like this because it has red. Some of you might like it too, but um, I know you guys are wanting this first. Do my hair so it was like a long bath, and I still didn't even do that with the bed. But there was only later when I was like, because my just so my sister's coming Saturday early, like noon. She should be here by like 1. Um, trying to be trying to be careful here. So, so the one said tomorrow early, but I don't know what that means or if it's going to be early. I mean, I'm counting on it as of now that the one will be here tomorrow early. She's like, "Okay, maybe we can get breakfast. Go to a bank." Um, it's not that I don't want them to come, Arthur. It's that like I know like my house isn't ready, and literally like I have the back pain, so it's like, what even can I do? And sometimes it's like just because you can do something, but you're gonna damage your back further, doesn't mean like maybe you should do that and damage your back. But knowing myself, I usually will just do it anyway and get hurt. And hi, John, Rob. She knows what's you're talking about me. Oh, from the Hulk shirt. Should I repost that where I ripped it off on the OF? And that was fun. Yeah, a legend. They better do him up right. Was it him that like sued Gawker? Because isn't there like a pretty good documentary about that on Netflix that involves a lot with him? I'm trying to see if I want you, Laura. I think it's pretty good for him. All right, we pick up on tonight. I don't know what chapter it's. I just know it's called. We're in part 2, and it's called "Sleeping with the Fishes." So let's see what that's about. Okay. Happy right here. Okay, chapter 14. What book? The Borgata, part 2 in the trilogy, the newest one. Okay. Hi, Stella. Hi, Bumble. Amidst all the tension, the Gallo faction went on a war footing. They stockpiled guns and ammunition and set up bunks and cots on the second floor of two attached brick buildings at 49 and 51 President Street in Brooklyn, both owned by the Gallo's grandmother, Mama Nunziato, who was hip to the streets. Once, when detectives were searching for Larry, Mama asked them why and was told that he was suspected of shooting someone who had miraculously survived. She chased them away and later scolded her grandson, telling him, "What's the matter, Larry? You can't shoot straight?" Nice, Grandma. Of the 30 odd men holed up inside President Street, half claim some form of sketchy employment, like no-show jobs or ownership of a pet supply store where the entire inventory consisted of a single dog leash displayed in the front window, or a delicatessen with only cardboard pictures of various meat products propped up in a dusty display case. 18 of I told you guys that once when I went to a business that was a front, and when I realized it was like some odd, sketchy, like, bakery that had no baked goods at all, and, like, I shouldn't be here. It wasn't here, that was in LA. Nearly everyone had long criminal records, and some also had distinguished military records, having served in the Second World War. Their combat experience on the Pacific Islands taught them to nail chicken wire across any open windows to stop someone from hurling in a hand grenade. Some of the cops assigned to surveil the mobsters on President Street had served overseas with them. Detective Vincent Kelly, for example, had fought alongside Tony Schatz at DeMarco during the 3rd Marine Division's heavy fighting on the island of Guam. Schatz and Kelly knew exactly which side of the street they were on in Brooklyn, but in the South Pacific, they were brothers and still felt a special camaraderie only combat veterans can understand. Now and then, one man or the other would cross the street to discuss the heroic battle they had survived together. The Gallo crew, known as the United Nations of the Underworld, spoke to the changing composition of the mafia's growing network of associates, as well as the exceptionally broad minded outlook of Italian Americans who bonded with everyone without prejudice. Besides Pete the Greek, Joey Gallo's other best friend was Ali Hassan Ali Baba Wafa, an Egyptian with a wife in Cairo. Larry Gallo's unofficial consigliere was Louis 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 the Syrian Kubela, who also fought heroically in the Second World War and handed the Arab neighborhoods in Brooklyn and handled the Arab neighborhoods in Brooklyn for sports betting and loan sharking. Louis the Syrian was related to another trusted Gallo crew member, Samuel Sammy the Syrian Zavralban. There were also two Jews, Sidney and Hyman, an African American named Wesley, an Irishman, a Puerto Rican, and plenty of Italians, one of whom had Asian Italian American children with his Japanese wife. Rounding out the Gallo crew was their faithful mascot, a 4 foot tall dwarf, Armando Iliano, who was the cousin of certified tough guy and crew member Frank Hachi Iliano. Mondo owned the Longshore Restaurant, a club where the gang played cards and billiards. He was a personable guy who made a huge impression on everyone he met, including the 6 foot tall blondes he was known to date. Mondo cared for the crew's female ocelot, known as Cleo the Lion, Joey purchased Cleo from an illegal animal trafficker who sold big cats, chimps, and monkeys. Cleo lived in Mondo's basement, which became known as the Lion's Den. Rumors that loan shark victims were dragged before her cage were untrue since Cleo was domesticated, but she did grow fast and they gave her away when she outgrew Mondo. While the men were holed up in the buildings, wives and girlfriends mm, mm, regularly dropped off food and necessities and smuggled in extra weapons, covered in plastic wrap and buried inside trays of lasagna and macaroni. Guns and ammunition were hidden in the basement, on the roof, and inside ceilings and walls. On a warm summer evening, passers-by on President Street could hear the music of Verdi or Puccini drifting from an open window. The music buff listening to the grand composers of Italian opera on his stolen phonograph was Larry Gallo, described by one FBI agent as the smartest hood I ever met. While Larry appreciated classical music and read the great books, Joey read Sartre, Nietzsche, Kafka, and Camus. Others in the crew liked poetry, painted, and one sculpted indoor and outdoor statues. Between the poets, painters, sculptors, and musicians, the cops might have wondered if they were staking out a mafia stronghold or the French salon of Gertrude Stein. Umberto Papagallo enjoyed cooking for everyone, often making big pots of macaroni sauce or gravy, as we used to call it, with sausage, meatballs, pig's feet, pig's skin, and pig's knuckles. He sometimes sent keeping plates of food to the cops assigned to stake out the street. The cops trusted the gallows enough to indulge and return the plates with a hearty thank you. Now that we have an idea of what the barracks on President Street were like, as well as the hybrid crew that resided there, we can return to Cicero and Don Lorenzo as they arrive on their diplomatic mission. Oh, thank you, Terry. Oh, she's domesticated. Yeah, unlike your cats that you shoved worm medicine in last night. We can return to Cicero and Don Lorenzo as they arrive on their diplomatic mission to get the hostages released. The older men patiently listened to Larry's grievances and appeared sympathetic, always speaking in a friendly tone without condescension. When they finally asked about the hostages, Larry assured them that they were all alive and well, and that no one would be killed if his list of demands was met. He wanted the gambling racket that once belonged to Frankie Schatz restored to Frankie's son, Tony Schatz, which meant the Gallows would co own it. And he wanted to install vending machines in Profaci owned or controlled businesses like restaurants and bowling alleys. He also demanded an immaculate cash settlement of $150,000. Seasoned mobsters like Profaci, Ciro, and Lorenzo were masters of artifice, able to disguise the impurity of their intentions behind platitudes such as honor and duty. They would never have demanded money in the midst of such a delicate situation, which made the gallows look like two big kidnappers in need of a ransom. It was a cheap move, but with 30 mouths to feed on President Street, Larry was hard up for cash. His ransom demand, poorly disguised as a settlement, was a major blunder as it revealed his desperation to Profaci, who needed only to stall and wear them down, which was what the wily old timer decided to do. The delegation departed, having made no commitments. When none of Larry's demands seemed forthcoming, he began to argue with Joey about the fate of the hostages. Joey wanted to kill them off, one each week, until their demands were met. Larry was against this and became so concerned that Joey might murder the hostages on his own that he released them prematurely, squandering any leverage he had over Profaci. The Profaci and Gallo factions settled into a state of eerie quietude that prevailed into the summer months and resembled Great Britain's phony war with Germany, a tense period of diplomatic and military inertia that both sides knew would end in fireworks. While John Scimone was still in captivity, he told the Gallows that he had considered their grievances and decided that they were in the right. At the time, Scimone knew the miserly Profaci would never fork out a ransom, so his change of heart may have been based on survival. After his release from captivity, Scimone fell back in with Profaci, but led Larry to believe that he was still sympathetic to the Gallo cause. On Sunday afternoon, August 20th, 1961, Scimone telephoned Larry and told him he had hit on a horse and wanted to share his winnings with him. Gamblers seldom boast of their winnings or offer to share any of it, but Larry trusted Scimone and was too strapped for cash to smell a trap. He hit on a horse. After Scamone handed Larry a few bucks, he invited him for a drink at the Sahara Lounge on Utica Avenue in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, telling him some of the boys will be there. Larry and Scamone entered the dimly lit lounge and were greeted by bartender Charles Charlie Brown Clemenza, who poured them drinks. Minutes later, Carmine Persico and Salvatore Sally D'Ambrosio, both of whom were on the Gallo side during the hostage crisis, walked in and greeted Larry and Scamone at the bar. As the four men chit-chatted, Persico slid behind Larry and looped a garrote around his throat. With Sally D's help, Persico was strangling the life out of 5'9", 125-pound Larry when, at approximately 2:50 p.m., Sergeant Edward Marr of the NYPD poked his head in the side door and said hello to Clemenza. Surprised to see the cop, the hoods dropped Gallo to the floor as the badge asked Clemenza, "How are things?" "Everything's fine," said Clemenza, pretending to spot clean glasses in the dark. "Everything's great." Marr heard Gallo moaning and stepped inside for a better look around. "Is that something on the floor?" he asked Clemenza. "Take him," yelled Sally D. "Not here," Clemenza yelled to his pals, fearing they would kill the cop. Scamone, Persico, and Sally D darted for the door, bulldozing Marr, who was thrown to the floor. Outside the bar, Marr's partner, 35-year-old Officer Melvin Blee, sprang from his squad car and was reaching for his gun when he was shot in the face by Sally D. As the injured Bly tumbled over the hood of his car, the three men piled into a white Cadillac and sped away. Marr got up, ran outside, squeezed off 2 rounds at the caddy, then tended to Bly and radioed for help. The Sahara Lounge was soon crawling with cops as Bly was rushed to the hospital in stable condition. A purple-faced Larry, who had blacked out, came to gasping for air. He struggled to his feet, then rubbed the rope around his neck. He was relieved to be alive, but terribly embarrassed when he realized he had soiled his pants. A cop assured him that it was a bodily reaction to the trauma, not a measure of his manhood. The cop helped him to the men's room, where Larry ditched his dirty underwear and washed up. When questioned, Larry had nothing to say. Asked about the bruise around his neck, he said it was from shaving. He was arrested, charged with assaulting himself, and held on $100,000 bail. New York Newsday ran a headline: "Cop halts rub out of Gallo, gets shot," while the New York Daily News accurately reported that Larry was still slated for murder by the underworld. The following day, newspapers wondered if Joey Gallo would be targeted too. The Daily News ran a photo of Joey with a caption that read, "Still alive as of yesterday," meaning they were uncertain if he would make it through the night. As Larry sat in the clink planning his revenge, the cops launched a series of raids on President Street in search of weapons. One detective found several guns under a dummy floor in a closet. He pointed to them and asked Kid Blast what they were. "It looks like guns," answered Blast. "Whose guns?" asked the detective. Oh, and they have a picture of him in the car with a rope around his neck. It looks, yeah, ow. He doesn't look happy. He looks a little bit in shock. Oh, thank you, Jerry. Oh, with the name. Well, I know how to say the Mar one, and I wouldn't have before that last book, or the one before last, because the Immortal Irishman. Gee, Blast shrugged. The former occupants of this apartment must have been some kind of malefactors. As it turned out, the guns were legal. Another raid turned up rifles, a carbine, and a shotgun with more ammunition, but these were also legal. During a third raid, the cops discovered four handguns in the basement of one of the buildings. Papa Gallo, who was caught in the basement next to the guns, said he had no idea who had put them there and that he was not hiding from the cops, but had gone into the cellar for some quiet time. Frustrated by all the excuses, the cops felt it was time to shake everyone up, so they dragged 11 members of the Gallo gang, including Joey, Papa Gallo, and Mondo the Midget, to the Raymond Street jail, where they spent the night. Kings County Judge Samuel Leibowitz was asked to hold Joey with no evidence of a crime having been committed. Leibowitz burned the request as unlawful, then said resignedly, "They're going to settle it their own way under their own rules. You can't expect other murders, or you can expect other murders." The judge added that even the members of Murder Inc. never shot a policeman, referring to Officer Bly, who had recovered from his injuries. The next morning, the crew was a, released on bail. On Joey's way out of the courtroom, reporter Gabriel Pressman asked him if he had anything to fear. Joey leaned down, threw an arm around Mondo, and said, "How can I be afraid when my bodyguard is with me?" Right on cue, Mondo the Midget growled at the reporter. Everyone seemed to get a laugh out of this, except Bobby Kennedy, who was closely following the rebellion from Washington. He put pressure on the Brooklyn cops and prosecutors to make more arrests and pushed the INS to deport Papagallo, who was born in southern Italy. Larry's lawyer bargained his bail down to $25,000. When the judge asked the assistant district attorney if he opposed the lower bail, he said, "If I were in his shoes and my bail was down it to $25, I'd stay in jail. But if he wants to walk the streets, that's his business." Larry posted bail and returned to President Street, where Joey threw him a party, but bluntly told him, "You should have done it my way," meaning Larry should have murdered the hostages. The next morning, the Gallo brothers, along with Pete the Greek, the Syrians, and Ali Baba, held a war council to discuss their next move. Larry's compare, Joe Jelly, was conspicuously absent from this high echelon gathering, which was extremely odd since Larry and Jelly were like peanut butter and jelly. As it turned out, Jelly was, as the expression goes, underwater with his own problems. In this case, the expression was quite literal. On the Wednesday before Larry was garroted, 5 men, including Sally D, Carmine Persico, and John Skimone, all of whom had ambushed Larry outside the Sahara Lounge, had invited Joe Jelly on a fishing trip. As Sally D's cabin cruiser handed out to sea, over the choppy waters of Sheepshead Bay, Joe Jelly was asked to set up Larry Gallo. We can guess what his answer was since he was shot, cut into pieces, stuffed into a weighted drum, and dumped overboard. Days later, a dead fish wrapped in Joe Jelly's jacket was tossed on the sidewalk in front of the Gallo family restaurant, Jackie's Sharkolets. The package contained Joe Jelly's ring finger, and the message was that Joe Jelly sleeps with the fish. Between Joe Jelly's gruesome death and the recent attempts on Larry's life, it was apparent that Joe Profaci had split the Young Turks in a classic divide and conquer. Persico, who Larry nicknamed the Snake after his betrayal at the Sahara Lounge, was now at the head of a splinter group that had broken off from the Gallo gang and was taking orders from Profaci. Carmen John Persico was born in Brooklyn on August 8, 1933, 2 years after Profaci officially founded the Brigada. His parents were Carmine Persico Sr. and Assunta, known as Susan. The couple married young. He was 20 and she was 18 and pregnant. One night, Carmine gave Susan a black eye. She called the police on him. When brought before a judge, Carmine admitted to hitting his wife and said, I believe in curfews for wives, Your Honor. 10:30 on the dot. She got home late, so I hit her. The couple had three sons. The oldest boy, Alphonse, who the underworld would come to know as Alley Boy. The next child was Carmine Jr., known as Junior or the Snake after he double crossed Larry at the Sahara Lounge. And then there was Theodore, known as Teddy. All three brothers became made men in Profaci's Brigada. Not long after the hostages were released, Profaci had convinced Carmen Persico that although the commission was. Hold on, one of them is calling me. Hello? What's that? Okay, at the Capital One. Okay. Okay, tomorrow morning, if I think of it tomorrow morning. Okay. Mhm. Okay. Well, get your sleep. Okay. I love you. Yeah. Yeah. My back. Yeah. It's usually not too bad, but when I put too much on it. Yeah, a strain, But it's okay. Yeah, Felix is gonna be barking at the trash people bringing their trash up tonight. Yeah, that's true. We'll see. Yeah, but I look forward to seeing you in the morning. We'll figure it out. All right. Well, let me know. I'm here. Love you. Bye. She wanted me to make an appointment, I guess, with the bank. And then, but then once she said it, she was like, "Oh wait, um, it's too late now. Okay, maybe in the morning. Oh, but wait, I'll be there in the morning early. Okay, rest your back. Don't do anything tonight. Um, how's Fila?" And she's like, "Maybe your sister can stay in that other room." She means here, because last time my sister stayed in my bed. Okay, sorry. Not long after the hostages were released, Grabacci had convinced Carmine Persico that although the commission was entertaining the Gallo revolt, they would never approve Larry as his replacement. So it was best to turn on Larry now in return for a reward. Had the Gallows been paying closer attention, there were early signs that Persico was working as a double agent in the weeks leading up to Joe Jelly's death and Larry's neck being squeezed like a wine press at the Sahara Lounge. Before Joe Jelly went missing, Persico was seen around the neighborhood looking for him and had asked a couple of guys to call Joe Jelly. The guys smelled trouble and did not want to get involved. At one point, Persico approached Marco Morelli, who said he could not betray anyone from the Gala crew before Morelli was taken for a ride and never seen again. Larry felt especially snubbed by Persico's betrayal and wanted revenge for his pal Joe Jelly. The American Mafia had a strict ban on explosives since the shrapnel could kill innocent people, but Larry ignored it and dispatched a demolition expert who planted a pipe bomb under Persico's car. When Persico got into the driver's seat, it was detonated. The explosion lifted the car off the ground, shattering glass and swinging the doors open. Like a scene from The Terminator, Persico somehow got it, staggering around in a circle for a minute or so, then brushed himself off and walked away like nothing had happened. Some said he was lucky, while others claimed he was indestructible. 2 months later, Larry took another shot at the snake. This time, a hit team hid in the back of a panel truck that cruised around Brooklyn in search of Persico. When the truck finally pulled alongside him and stopped, two gunmen opened the side door and unloaded their weapons, hitting Persico in the hand, arm, shoulder, and face. The truck sped off, but once again, the Terminator was alive. Surviving the second murder attempt worked wonders for Persico's reputation, as word spread that he had spat a bullet out of his mouth. In truth, the bullet was lodged in Persico's cheek and fell out at the hospital. What else could have been done with it? Swallow it? Persico refused to tell detectives who shot him, and he left the hospital with a paralyzed arm. This permanent war injury and his second Purple Heart in 2 months contributed to his growing fame and another nickname, the Immortal. On October 4th, 1961, Gallo loyalist Joseph Joe Mags Magnasco was cruising along a Brooklyn street when he spotted Profaci loyalist Harry and Sal Fontana. When Magnasco grabbed Harry by the collar, Sal drew a 32 caliber revolver and shot Magnasco in the chest 3 times. Like his cousin, Tony shots Marco, Manasco was a highly decorated war hero. He had survived Japanese bonsai attacks on the bloody sands of the Pacific only to die on a dirty sidewalk in Brooklyn. Tony Schott's wife, Lucy Marco, happened to be emerging from a subway station as Magnasco was bleeding out on the pavement. My God, she yelled, that's my cousin Joe. With a war underway and frustrated cops unable to make a caller, prosecutors subpoenaed Joey Gallo, who over the years had been served with dozens of subpoenas from the same assistant district attorney, Walter Buchminder. Joey told him, Walter, someday I'm going to give you one of these things. I've had about 100 from you, and you haven't solved a crime yet. When the Gallo crew was rounded up for a photo lineup and asked if they could identify Magnasco's killer, Mondo the Midget told detectives, I saw his belt buckle. Show me a lineup of belts and I might be able to recognize it. 2 weeks after Magnasco was murdered, the Gallows decided to take another shot at knocking off the chief. Word had it that Profaci was slipping in and out of Brooklyn while remaining holed up at his hunting lodge in New Jersey, which was patrolled by shotgun-carrying soldiers. When Larry found out that Profaci would be at a country club, he dispatched a hit team, but Profaci was either tipped off or spooked and easily escaped unscathed, continuing his incredible lucky streak. On November 11, 2 Gallo men stormed into a lounge and killed 2 Profaci associates. 3 weeks later, on December 2nd, Persico and Sally D dressed as women and drove around Brooklyn in search of Larry. What? What? Who had left the barracks on President Street for a secret meeting with Tony Bender. When they spotted Larry, they fired at him with a shotgun but missed. Next, Crazy Joe was taken out by the law. Joey was a professional extortionist, but the gang was desperate for money and Joey got sloppy. He was shaking down legitimate businessmen who begged Joey for some extra time to cough up the dough. Sure, take time, said Joey. Take 3 months in a hospital on me. Unbeknownst to Joey, the victim had alerted the bulls who were staked down nearby. They made a quick arrest. After a 3-day trial, Joey was convicted on all counts and was given a 7 to 14-year sentence. Bobby Kennedy, who was still following the war from afar, was thrilled with the verdict and the stiff sentence, as was Profaci, who called for a ceasefire now that the hot-headed Joey was taken off the streets. The expense of war taxes a mafia family as it would a nation, and by 1962, the FBI filed a report stating that Profaci's policy business was taking a beating on account of the war, while the Gallows Street income had completely evaporated. Beyond Larry's financial woes, Tony Bender, who had been Larry's staunchest advocate, was ordered by Genovese to set the gallows adrift. Once it became clear that Profaci had rallied the troops and the gallows had no clear path to victory, the crew became a liability. Let us not forget that Genovese was an imprisoned boss who was vulnerable to an insurrection and did not find it politically expedient to support a failed rebellion. Bender, who was blamed for betting on the wrong horse, had even bigger problems than Gallo. Rumor had it that Bender, who oversaw the importation of drugs along the New Jersey waterfronts, had somehow contributed to Genovese's imprisonment, which conveniently left Bender in charge. Genovese further believed that Bender was thinking about making a power grab. During the first week of April, the 62-year-old bespectacled Tony Bender started spending more time in his palatial Fort Lee, New Jersey home built on a bluff overlooking Manhattan. Knowing Genovese was suspicious of him, he tried to get his mind off the rackets by preparing his garden for spring and filling up his swimming pool. On Sunday, April 8th at around 10:40 p.m., he told his wife of 30 years, Edna, that he was running out for a pack of cigarettes. You better put on your coat, said Edna. It's chilly. Well, I'm only going to be a few minutes, Bender replied. Besides, I'm wearing my thermal underwear. He should have been wearing armored underwear. Bender pulled away from the house in his black Cadillac sedan and was never seen or heard from again. His wife told police, I'm sure something awful must have happened to him. She was right. It was believed that he was cut up into little pieces, and his gum mare, described by the press as an attractive brunette sports clothes designer, disappeared the following day, almost certainly as a precautionary measure in case Bender had engaged in too much pillow talk. No one could escape Genovese's wrath, except one soldier who happened to be Genovese's nose, doing time with him in Atlanta Penitentiary. Chapter 15, Mistaken Identity? Question mark. I feel like my bow's coming out. Hold on. My hair is wet. As a teenager, Joseph Michael Valachi, known as Joe Colombo, ran with a gang of petty thieves and did a short stint in Sing Sing, where he met a few wise guys who took a liking to him. By his own admission, he was a Neapolitan who fell in with the Sicilian mafia during the Castellamarese War when Salvatore Maranzano needed recruits. After Maranzano was killed, Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese assigned Valachi to Tony Bender's crew, where he led a rather undistinguished career as a soldier. In 1962, Valachi was serving a 15-year stretch in the same penitentiary as his Don, Vito Genovese, when another inmate labeled Valachi a snitch. Since historians contend that Valachi was not a snitch at this point, it is incumbent upon me to correct the record while pointing out their ignorance of La Cosa Nostra law and universal prison rules. Valachi was serving time for drug trafficking. In order to get a lighter sentence, he informed on several drug dealers who were not part of the Italian American mafia. Because Valachi did not snitch on his fellow mobsters, he did not consider himself a rat, and historians have accepted his distorted opinion on himself as accurate. But according to La Costa Nostra, anyone who tells on anyone else is a rat. And for those of us who have served hard time, the rules in prison are just as strict. If, for example, an Italian mobster informs on Black or Hispanic drug dealers but spares his fellow Italians, he is still a rat to us Italians who have stood up and are serving time alongside those same Black and Hispanic convicts who have also stood up. Not surprisingly, Genovese saw it this way too. Valachi therefore knew once he was outed as a rat, he was in serious trouble with Genovese. Fearing for his life, Valachi checked in, meaning he asked the prison guards to take him into protective custody. In prison, a check-in in and of itself is considered a rat move, since real men are expected to confront threats and accusations, not run from them. Another fear factor behind Balachi's check-in, overlooked until now, was Tony Bender's recent disappearance. Bender was labeled a rat before taking his final ride. Since Valachi was in Tony Bender's crew, he would have known that Genovese was examining that particular bushel for more rotten apples. While relatively safe in protective custody, Valachi asked to speak with narcotics agents, which meant he was now prepared to open up about his fellow mobsters. Unfortunately for Valachi, the agents never arrived, and prison officials released him back onto the compound where Giuseppe Joe Beck di Palermo was waiting with orders from Genovese to kill Valachi. Between the snitch label and the check-in, which only confirmed the label, Valachi knew he was a dead man. Before Joe Beck could get the jump on him, Valachi ran up to inmate John Joseph South and beat him to death with an iron pipe. Valachi later claimed that he mistook the 52-year-old South, described as a weasel-faced postal thief, for the hardened mobster Joe Beck, and historians have taken him at his word yet again and repeated this story ever since. Let us presently unravel this fallacy and put it to rest once and for all. To start with, Valachi knew exactly who Joe Beck was. They had been in the same borgata and the same damn crew for the past 30 years. Joe Beck was, moreover, a major heroin trafficker who regularly supplied Valachi with drugs. They were not only lifelong friends and business associates, but were squeezed into the same prison together where they would have passed each other a dozen times a day and eaten the same Italian table 3 times a day. I can tell you from experience in a maximum security penitentiary where life hangs by a thread, every one of us knew every single face in our cramped environment so well that if a newbie entered the yard, we all turned to look at him. Why then did Valachi claim to mistake Joseph Stout for Joe Beck, a bespectacled man with long arms and legs whose appearance was unmistakable? After Valachi was ejected from protective custody, the only way to get back into of an the safety of an isolation unit was to commit an assault on another inmate, which warrants an immediate trip to the hole and is often followed by a transfer to another prison. Contrary to Valachi's claim that he had accidentally killed the wrong guy, excusing himself by saying, "They're both ugly, they're both skinny." Valachi had looked around the prison yard for the weakest animal in the herd and had piped over the head a non-violent forger in order to escape Vito Genovese and Joe Beck and save his own life. He may not have intended to kill South, who clung to life for 3 days, but he needed to remove himself from the compound by way of an assault, and he confirmed this when he said, "I told the warden to just lock me up," giving away his motive since convicts never volunteer for punishment. I am so sure that Valachi did not mistake Salt for Beck that I would bet my own life on it. After the death of Joseph Salt, who had no mafia ties whatsoever, Valachi faced the death penalty from the law instead of the mob, but he could talk his way out of this mess, and he had plenty to say. Once again, Valachi asked to speak with federal agents, and this time, with blood on his hands, he was taken more seriously. Narcotics agents rushed to visit him in the Atlanta penitentiary, but they did not have Valachi long before he was taken away from them. Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Charles Siragusa, said, Bobby Kennedy called me in Washington and asked me if the Justice Department could question Valachi. So we gave him access to Valachi, who was turning out to be one of our best sources for information. Then, before you knew it, Bobby Kennedy, because of his hatred of the mob, had completely taken possession of Valachi. Frankly, we were pretty upset about it. On Bobby's orders, the FBI spirited Valachi to an army barracks at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where Agent James Flynn was assigned the trying task of picking through Valachi's demented mind. Flynn also had to deal with Valachi's whiny complaints, the first of which lends insight into his deep-seated resentment toward his Don, Vito Genovese, who had never raised Valachi above the rank of soldier. Valachi bitched about being confined to the quarters of a mere enlisted man and demanded that he be housed in an officer's suite. The FBI obliged, and each morning Agent Flynn showed up at Valachi's heavily guarded suite with food and cigarettes. As Valachi ate Italian specialties like Genoa salami, pepperoni, and provolone, and puffed through 3 packs of cigarettes a day, he recounted for Flynn his involvements in 33 homicides. In order to get the most mileage out of Valachi's tongue, Flynn sympathized with him, complimented him, learned how to react to his mood swings, and allowed him to blame his crimes on everyone else, resisting the temptation to point out Valachi's failure to accept any responsibility for his own actions. In addition to recounting a seemingly endless catalog of crimes, Valachi told Flynn who the FBI should target as potential informants based on what he felt was who he felt was embittered like him. The FBI followed Valachi's advice and was able to recruit a number of new informants. Flynn and Valachi usually wrapped up their debriefings before lunchtime, just as Valachi became too irritable to handle. As Vito Genovese tried to figure out if there was still a way to kill Joe Valachi, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and Joe Bonanno called for a second commission meeting to try and bring an end to the underworld and taxing of their wallets. The meeting was held in the basement of a Long Island restaurant. Larry Gallo showed up, but once again, Joe Profaci did not. This time, Profaci's absence was genuinely on account of his illness, the severity of which he hid from the other bosses. Knowing the vultures would circle the injured prey, Gambino, Lucchese, and Bonanno were joined by Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, who represented the Genovese family. Gambino opened the meeting by suggesting to the other Dons that Profaci gracefully ease into retirement. As expected, the Other Don, as expected, Lucchese agreed with Gambino, and according to Banana, who defended Profaci, they made it sound as if Profaci would be doing himself a favor if he retired. Banana's firm stance behind Profaci contained an element of self-defense. If Profaci would attempt was knocked off the round table, Banana would be isolated and they would attempt to retire him next. It was the only way to delay an expected attack on himself. Although it may have appeared that Gambino and Lucchese were standing behind Gallo by pushing for Profaci's retirement, this was not the case. They went on to say that the war needed to end and that could only happen when Profaci and Gallo stepped aside and allowed for a new boss who was acceptable to both factions. Naturally, Gambino and Lucchese wanted to choose Profaci's replacement so they could exert some influence over the fractured Gorgana. As for Jimmy Blue Eyes, he remained neutral. Which confirmed that the Genovese family had abandoned Larry Gallo. When Profaci heard a recap of the meeting's minutes from Bonanno, he was enraged and adamantly refused to step down. He probably would have held out forever, but life does not offer that luxury. On June 6, 1962, Profaci died of liver cancer at Long Island's South Side Hospital. At the time of his death, he was still delinquent to the tune of $1.5 million in government taxes. And detectives estimated his net worth somewhere in the region of 100 to 200 million dollars. The olive oil king, who had once stolen a horse in Sicily, galloped into Valhalla laughing. No sooner had Larry Gallo been set adrift by the commission and Joe Profaci been buried than Tony Schatz Abatimarco walked out of the front door of President Street, followed by half the Gallo crew. The group exited the barracks so abruptly that some of the men left behind their personal belongings. Tony Schatz's defection came as a complete surprise to Larry Gallo, who learned that Schatz had been wooed away from him by Carmen the Snake Persico. I have been told that Tony Schatz had begun to suspect that the Gallos were behind his father's murder, and the whispers came from Persico. For most of Profaci's reign, his brother was his consigliere, and his brother-in-law Joe Magliocco was his underboss. Back in Sicily, the Profacis were long-standing friends and allies with the Maglioccos. Profaci's wife, Ninfa, was a Magliocco, and after Profaci's death, Joe Magliocco quickly steps into Profaci's shoes. Since Magliocco was close with Joe Bonanno, his elevation in the eyes of Gambino and Lucchese was acceptable, but unlike Profaci, who Gambino and Lucchese could not force into retirement, they had a rightful say in the matter of Magliocco's ascension. By rule, the commission had the authority to sanction whoever claimed Profaci's old seat at the table, suddenly empowering Gambino and Lucchese as kingmakers. They immediately rejected Magliocco, asserting that he was only a dumber, fatter version of Profaci. Bonanno, who was fast to recognize Magliocco, worked behind the scenes to keep him in place, while Gambino and Lucchese looked around for malleable replacements. Larry Gallo was not in the running, but that did not stop him from trying. He and Carmen the Snake Persico, each with a rival crew of young toughs, jockey for position, creating renewed tension until hostilities resumed in June 1963, 1 year after Profaci's death. Gallo loyalist Emilio Colatuono was gunned down. The next month, the still imprisoned Joey Gallo took a personal blow when Ali Baba was shot to death in New Jersey. A lot of these men dying. Following Profaci's death, Ali Baba had taken to sea as a chef on a cruise ship. He was known as he was a known hashish trafficker, and his job on the ship may have been a cover for international drug smuggling. In mid-July, Ali Baba disembarked on a pier in Hoboken, New Jersey, and was probably waiting for a ride to arrive when two men in a car rolled up and shot him with a 45 automatic. He clung to life for a couple of days in critical condition, then died, leaving Joey Gallo heartbroken. Ali Baba had been the best man at Joey's wedding, and Joey's wife said he was part of Joey and me. Pete the Greek said of Joey and Ali, they loved each other. In August, Joseph Joe Bass Cordiello was shot to death and he sat in his car. That same day, Johnny Moose Batista and Tony Fats Regina murdered Cadillac Louis Mariani. Gambino and Lucchese were quick to blame Magliocco for the latest outbreak of violence and were planning to relocate him to a nearby cemetery when Magliocco figured he should get the jump on them. Magliocco gave Salvatore Sally the Sheik Musacchio a contract on Gambino and Lucchese. History is replete with lessons that escaped Magliocco. In AD 204, Plautianus, commander of Rome's notorious Praetorian Guard, ordered a double hit on Septimius Severus and his son Caracalla, but the man Plautianus entrusted with the contract went straight to the targets and alerted them, resulting in Platonius's ignominious death. In this case, Sally the Sheik recruited Joe Colombo, who went straight to Gambino and alerted him to the plot, which thickened when Gambino found out that Joe Bonanno's son Bill was with Magliocco. When the latter gave the contract to the Sheik, Gambino and Lucchese concluded that Joe Bonanno must have sent Bill to feed the idea of a double hit to the dim-witted Magliocco. Bonanno the elder vehemently denied the accusation, insisting that Bonanno the younger was having marital problems with Rosalie Profaci and was staying at Magliocco's heavily guarded Long Island estate to seek his marital advice. That Magliocco, who could not keep his own crime family together, was a sought after marriage counselor sounded absurd to Gambino and Lucchese, who summoned Magliocco before the commission, where he was questioned, broke under pressure, and confessed to the conspiracy. He begged for his life, proving how terribly unfit he was for the job anyway. As a reward for betraying the plot, the commission anointed the 40-year-old Joe Colombo as the new boss of the old Profaci Borgata, with orders to stabilize the warring factions. Gambino and Lucchese had found their puppets. Chapter 16. He is going to be hit. Joseph Anthony Colombo was born in Brooklyn on June 16, 1923. His father, known as Tony Durante and Tony Two Guns, was a Calabrian-born immigrant and member of the Profaci Brigada, who was garroted to death in 1938 on orders from Profaci after Colombo was caught cheating with a married woman who was found dead alongside him. 14-year-old Joe Colombo began thieving to help care for his widowed mother and his sister. During the Second World War, he served in the Coast Guard. After the war, he went to work on the Brooklyn waterfront as a longshoreman, where he stole pallets of merchandise and took numbers on the side. He eventually got a sales job with a wholesale meat company controlled by Carlo Gambino, who had known him since he was a boy. Later in life, Colombo became a real estate broker for Cantalupo Realty in Brooklyn. A stand-in took the realtor exam for him, and the local realtor's office was suddenly transformed into a hub of mob activity. To establish a legitimate income of approximately $35,000 a year, other realtors transferred their sales commissions to Colombo, who would repay them with cash under the table. The brokers were happy to save on taxes, which Colombo was happy to pay in order to create a seemingly lawful income. The steps Colombo took to maintain the appearance of a legitimate businessman, combined with his subdued lifestyle, appealed to the low-key Gambino, who maneuvered him into place at the head of Profaci's Borgata after Colombo betrayed Magliocco's plot. Colombo was so low-key that some members of the Borgata had no idea where he had emerged from when he was suddenly elevated to the throne. In fact, the FBI did not even have a current surveillance photo or mugshot of him on record. Not everyone in the Borgata was happy with how Colombo had achieved power. One mobster said of his betrayal of the plot, he sold out his outfit, he played position. Because Colombo was never a huge earner, Gambino loaned him $1 million so he could push it onto the street in smaller loans as a sort of mini Marshall Plan to help boost the war-torn economy that had ravaged the Profaci Borgata after the last several years. In return, Colombo was expected to vote with Gambino at commission meetings, which he faithfully did, essentially giving Gambino two votes at the table. To appease the Gallo crew, Colombo promised to spread the bread and raised Larry to a capo to prove his sincerity. He also made Carmine the Snake Persico a capo in light of his chest full of purple hearts and in defense to the mighty crew he had built up in Park Slope, Brooklyn. With everyone momentarily placated, the Borgata appeared to be one big happy family of mobsters across the country who were still scrambling to survive Bobby Kennedy's personal jihad to dismantle organized crime. Within 2 years of Bobby becoming Attorney General, indictments secured against mobsters rose from 0 to 683, and the number of defendants went from 0 to 619. While exerting unprecedented pressure on the mob, Bobby continued to criticize FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover openly and privately for withholding the full might of the FBI. Throughout 1963, Bobby repeatedly told people around him at the Justice Department that Hoover, who was approaching 70 years old, the government's mandatory retirement age, would not be the director for Jack's second term in office. Bobby's vow to retire Hoover from office is incomprehensible given Hoover's ever fattening files on the Kennedy family and his not so subtle threats to use them if forced. Numerous witnesses have expressed Hoover's dire fear of being pushed out of office, which may have reminded him of his own father's downfall. The man suffered a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized after losing his government job. The very idea of retirement terrified him, said Dec DeLoach, who also revealed that once a year Hoover would invite him and Clyde Tolson to his house for dinner. It was not his birthday he was celebrating, wrote Deloach, but usually the anniversary as of the day he was named director of the FBI. As if that moment his life had really begun. If the directorship was the beginning of Hoover's life, then Bobby was literally threatening to end it. Not surprisingly, Bobby's intention to retire Hoover got back to the director, who was secretly listening in on everyone's conversations, including mobsters who expressed feelings toward the Kennedys that Hoover would have shared. Hoover's secret listening devices, planted in mob hangouts across the country, picked up ceaseless stream of threats made toward the Kennedy brothers from a number of high-ranking mobsters. As early as the summer of 1962, Michelino Mickey Clementi told Joe Profaci's brother Sal, Bob Kennedy won't stop today until he puts us all in jail all over the country. Until the commission meets and puts its foot down, things will be at a standstill. Around the same time, an unidentified Genovese family mobster was overheard saying, I'd like to hit Kennedy. I would gladly go to the penitentiary for the rest of my life. Believe me, that same year, Philadelphia Don Angelo Bruno, who was a close friend and ally of Carlo Gambino, was overheard discussing President Kennedy with mob associate Willie Weisberg, who said with Kennedy, a guy should take a knife and stab and kill the fucker where he is now. Somebody should kill the fucker. I mean it. This is true. Honest to God, it's about time to go. But I tell you something, I hope I get a week's notice. I'll kill right in the White House. Somebody's got to get rid of this fucker. Yeah, but doesn't mean he meant it, though. I mean, a knife. It's Terry. Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't guys threaten to beat each other up all the time and they don't mean it? You better tell me it's true or I'll kick your ass. On another occasion, Angelo Bruno was talking with his in-laws, wise guys Mario and Peter Maggio, though it is unclear which Maggio is speaking. Maggio, President Kennedy wants Edgar Hoover out of the FBI because he is a fairy. You know he is a fairy. I heard that. Who? Edgar Hoover is a fairy. Who would ever listen to that bullshit? Wow, what a brilliant conversation. Hoover, that's who. The lifelong bachelor who lived with his mother until her death was taking it all in, reading every transcript that crossed his desk, as he also learned that Bobby referred to him as a fucking cocksucker and wondered if he had to squat to pee. Bobby also disparaged Hoover's right-hand man, Clyde Tolson, whose rapid rise would go unmatched in the entire history of the Bureau. Hoover and Tolson ate meals together, spent weekends and holidays together, and took vacations together, leading to whispers in Washington. Bobby often referred to Tolson as J. Edna, and once when Tolson was hospitalized for a medical procedure, Bobby mused aloud that it was for a hysterectomy. Back when Bobby was working with Joseph McCarthy, the notorious senator who hunted American communists, one of Bobby's tasks was the investigation of homosexuals inside the State Department. Reminiscent of those outdated days, Bobby now ordered his organized crime chief, William Hunley, to compile a dossier on Hoover. We tried to prove that Hoover was a homosexual. Hunley later confessed. As for the Kennedy brothers' plan to boot Hoover out, Hunley confirmed that Bobby mentioned it to many people and it got back to Hoover. The man who was in power for decades, the man who was obsessed with his image, the image of his agents, and the reputation of his bureau, the man who annually celebrated the day he became director, was about to be smeared as a homosexual, which was socially and institutionally unacceptable in the 1960s, and forced into a shameful retirement. Hoover's very survival was on the line, and the only thing that could save him from total ruin was if the Kennedys went first. Was this why Hoover was attentively listening to the mob's death threats toward the president, but did nothing about them? In July 1962, Carlos Marcello invited friends and family to his Grand Isle fishing camp and vacation lodge in the Mississippi Delta. While Marcello was drinking a scotch, a friend of his commented about the Supreme Court's recent decision to uphold Marcello's deportation order. Marcello spat out his scotch and shouted, "Don't worry, man, about dat Bobby. We going to take care of that son of a bitch." Marcello was asked if he meant that Bobby would be whacked. "What good that do?" answered Marcello. "You hit that man and his brother calls out the National Guard. Now you gotta hit the top man." On another occasion, Marcello made a similar remark about the Kennedys, saying, "The dog will keep biting you if you only cut off its tail," meaning that Bobby was the tail and Jack, the dog's head, needed to be cut off in order for the dog to die. A witness said that Marcello had already thought of using a nut to do the job. In September, Marcello made another ominous outburst, this time at Churchill Farms, his 6,400-acre estate on the outskirts of New Orleans. Marcello was drinking with some pals at a picnic table when a caretaker heard someone bring up Bobby's name, which was off limits unless you wanted to watch steam rise from Marcello's ears. "Don't worry about that little Bobby, son of a bitch," Marcello screamed across the table. "He's driving my wife fucking crazy. All Jackie do is cry every night, all night, thinking Kennedy is going to throw me out of the country again. She can't sleep. Bobby is driving my daughters crazy, too. They don't want to lose their daddy. Well, I'll tell you boys they ain't going to lose their old man. No, sir, because I got a plan. Wait and see if that son of a bitch, Bobby Kennedy, is going to take me away from my wife and kids." I mean, I still don't think that means anything. What? I'm just thinking of all the people that threaten like Trump or whatever. And it's like, I mean, they're not serious. Like, you can't, if something happened to him, you can't seriously be like, a lot of people are just joking or blowing off steam. I don't know. I think I mean, for all you know, his plan was like, we're gonna, we're gonna shave his hair. I mean, because I don't think he had a beard. Yeah. Okay. The very same month that Marcella was threatening the Kennedys in Louisiana, Santo Trafficante met in Florida with Cuban exile leader and criminal associate Jose Alman, the son of an incomparably corrupt Cuban cabinet minister who, when asked how he had stolen millions of dollars from the Cuban treasury, replied in suitcases. Upon arriving in Miami, Alman, who inherited his father's vast real estate holdings in Miami, sought out the Florida Don who helped him acquire construction loans through the Teamster Pension Fund. While sitting in Miami's Scott Bryant Hotel, where they met to discuss a $1.5 million real estate loan that had already been cleared by Jimmy Hoffa. Trafficante, who was an avid reader, spoke almost poetically, according to Allen, about democracy and civil liberties that were being trampled upon by Bobby Kennedy. Finally, Trafficante said to Alman, "Mark my words, this man Kennedy is in trouble, and he will get what is coming to him." Alman, who did not understand the extent of what Trafficante meant, told him he should sit tight and wait Kennedy out until he was voted out of office. "No, Jose," answered Trafficante, "he is going to be his." It was abundantly clear to Alman that Trafficante was privy to an assassination plot against the president, if not personally involved. Unbeknownst to Trafficante, Alman was an active informant for the CIA and the FBI, regularly reporting to the latter about Trafficante's underworld rackets. Mm. Including Bolita, loan sharking, and drug trafficking. He left the meeting and went straight to the FBI field office in Miami to report Trafficante's unsettling remarks to his FBI handlers. The agents on duty, Paul Scranton and George Davis, listened carefully, then reported Trafficante's remarks to their superior, Special Agent in Charge Wesley Grapp. Grapp forwarded a report to Hoover in Washington, where the information died on his desk. Hoover did not launch an investigation, nor did he ask to speak with the Attorney General, the head of the Secret Service, or request an audience with the president, as he had quickly done after the Judith Campbell affair had come to his attention. On September 27th, another wise guy was overheard saying that all the mafia's problems were instigated by Robert Kennedy, who was murdering the Italian name. 2 days later, Ed Parton, an inmate at Baton Rouge, Louisiana jail, told his keepers that Jimmy Hoffa had once asked him to assassinate Bobby Kennedy. According to Parton, Hoffa told him, "I've got to do something about that son of a bitch, Bobby Kennedy. He's got to go." Hoffa further told Parton that Bobby drives alone in a convertible and swims by himself. a 270 rifle with a high power scope on it. It would be easy to get him with that. As another option, Hoppa suggested that Parton throw a plastic bomb into Bobby's house, assuring him that Bobby had so many enemies now they wouldn't know who had done it. The warning contacted the FBI, who gave Parton a lie detector test, which he passed. To recap, in the month of September alone, threats from Teamster leader Jimmy Hoffa and Mafia chieftains Santo Traficante and Carlos Marcello were made in Washington, Florida, and Louisiana, and attested to by multiple witnesses. In October, Marcello took one last shot at avoiding violence when he asked Sam Giancana to have his pal Frank Sinatra considered the ambassador between the U.S. government and the mob, visit the president and ask him to reel Bobby in a few notches. While hanging out with Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, Sinatra was at the same time a regular guest at the White House and frequent visitor to the Kennedys' Hyannisport and Palm Beach homes. But although Sinatra had gotten the mob into this mess by striking a deal with Joe Kennedy Sr., the patriarch had since become incapacitated and unable to exert influence over his sons. On December 19, 1961, the 74-year-old Joe Sr. played a round of golf at the Palm Beach golf course. After the 16th hole, he felt faint, and by 2 p.m., he was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital. He had suffered a stroke caused by a blood clot in the brain. From then on, he was paralyzed and unable to speak. There were moments when he was desperate to communicate, said Oleg Cassini, but he couldn't. It was only 11 months into Jack's presidency, and the man who had made the mob so many promises was invalid. Although his sons may have been free of his tyranny, they were also freed from the promises he had made to mobsters. And devoid of his guidance, the tragedy was Joe Kennedy getting a stroke, said Gore Vidal. He could have settled the problem with the mafia in 2 minutes. Charles Bartlett, a family friend who became the Washington bureau chief of the Chattanooga Times, said that Joe was very strong. He'd done things for the kids and wanted them to do some things for him. He didn't bend. Joe was tough. Not anymore, according to one biographer. Joe Kennedy was in an instant transformed from the most vital, the smartest, the dominant one in the room to a gnarled, crippled, drooling, speechless, wheelchair-bound, utterly dependent shell of a man. He could not dress himself, feed himself, shave or shower, or communicate his thoughts, desires, fears, or hopes in spoken or written language. This meant that the mob and Sinatra were out of luck. Still, Giancana and Roselli talked to Sinatra, who was fairly confident he'd get Bobby to ease up, or have Jack yank the stick out of Bobby's ass. Sinatra visited the Kennedys, but his diplomatic mission backfired. Bobby was incensed by the intrusion and wanted Jack to cut ties with Sinatra, which he did after being shown a Justice Department report linking Sinatra to Cosa Nostra bosses around the country. While this was happening, Sinatra was looking forward to having Kennedy as a guest at his Springs estate and had built a helicopter pad for Marine One. Kennedy canceled at the last minute while also scratching Sinatra from the guest list of a White House dinner. Thanks to Bobby, the man who had helped Jack into office and had arranged the inaugural gala was persona non grata, and instead of turning down the heat on the mob, Bobby turned it up. Around the same time, the Soviets turned up the heat on President Kennedy in Cuba, resulting in another mismanaged debacle that would drive an already embittered group of Cuban exiles who were trained to kill by the CIA even closer to Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante. Halo Mansion. Part 3, Conspiracy and Cover-Up. How does that X-Files go? I never seen an episode, but isn't it? It's crazy. These are the X-Files. I'm coffee. Maybe I'll get some more coffee tomorrow. Mm. Okay, chapter 17, Missiles and Whistles. Following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the Soviet Union supported the Cuban economy by increasing economic and military aid to the tiny island nation. In turn, propping up the already popular Castro regime. But Fidel Castro still feared that a second US-led invasion was imminent, and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev did not think, if that were to happen, that the US would fumble the ball a second time. To neutralize this possibility, Khrushchev took a drastic measure that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Early on the morning of October 16, 1962, President Kennedy summoned Bobby Kennedy to the White House to tell him he had just been informed by the CIA that the Soviets were constructing an atomic missile base in Cuba. Back in September, President Kennedy had halted reconnaissance flights over Cuba after an American surveillance pilot was shot down in Soviet airspace. During the surveillance gap that went on for 45 days, the Soviets had slipped nearly 100 nuclear warheads into Cuba. Whoa, that's a lot. After CIA Director John McCone pushed the president to resume surveillance, following a tip from Soviet spy, the alarming high-altitude photographs were taken. For the next 13 days, the White House was thrust into the first Cold War crisis to date. Unlike the Bay of Pigs, when Kennedy wanted to hide America's complicity in the invasion, the United States was now provoked with every right to defend itself. This was the ideal pretext for a military invasion that many in the administration, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the CIA had dreamed of. U.S. Marines would not look like the imperialist mercenaries Castro painted them as, but patriotic defenders of a nation threatened with nuclear holocaust. Okay, now guys, you know what to do if there's a nuclear threat, okay? You duck and cover. I think I learned that on videotape. And get your ID bracelet so they can identify your body. Thank me later. As the Joint Chiefs urged the president to strike at Cuba, news of the crisis leaked out, and the Cuban exile community felt a sudden renewal of hope. Since that, Kennedy had no choice but to invade the island, but the majority of Kennedy's cabinet, including Bobby, were of the opinion that a blockade allowing no Soviet vessel in or out of Cuban waters would be most effective and less provocative toward the Soviets, who could launch a nuclear strike on the United States or retaliate with military aggression in Berlin. While the president mulled over his options, military reserves were activated, soldiers and tanks were moved down to Florida, missile crews and tactile air squadrons were placed on maximum alert. B-52 bombers were loaded, and the Navy deployed some 200 ships into the Caribbean. With his small nation squeezed between two superpowers, a reckless Castro urged the Soviets to launch a nuclear attack on the United States. Khrushchev who sometimes feigned lunacy on the world stage, sanely reminded Castro that his little island would be crushed into power. At the height of the crisis, McCone ordered America's 007, William Harvey, to desist from his usual sabotage missions into Cuba, which could aggravate the situation. True to character, Harvey ignored McCone's orders to stand down and sent raiding parties into Cuba to pave the way for a full scale military invasion. A number of CIA witnesses later said that Johnny Rosselli accompanied Cuban exiles on dangerous missions along the island's coastline. For all of his tailor made clothing and careful Hollywood style grooming, wrote one author, Johnny had guts, pure and simple. In one incident, Roselli's boat was shot out from under him. The fit 58-year-old wise guy who frequented golf courses and yacht clubs courageously swam in the choppy, dark sea until he was rescued by a friendly vessel. The U.S. allies were in favor of an invasion of the island. After being informed of the crisis, Britain's Prime Minister Harold Macmillan advised Kennedy to invade and be done with it, while France's Charles de Gaulle, who had Khrushchev pegged as a bluffer, demanded that Kennedy stand up to him. This was in sync with Kennedy's Joint Chiefs of Staff, who felt the Soviets were dead wrong and would suck up a good clobbering. Kennedy's Foreign Relations Committee chairman, J. William Fulbright, agreed with the Joint Chiefs, telling the president, I'm in favor of an invasion and an all out one, and as quickly as possible. On the flip side, Bobby Kennedy argued against an invasion with a vehemence that startled most of the men in the room. Bobby believed that an attack on the small island would smear America's reputation on the world stage and blacken the name of the United States in the pages of history. After intense discussions with his cabinet, President Kennedy leaned toward a blockade. Feeling that if it were broken, the U.S. could then retaliate, the Joint Chiefs warned the president that the blockade would allow the Soviets more time to arm the missiles. As with the Bay of Pigs, the president stood his ground against the experts, and on the morning of Saturday, October 20th, he opted for a quarantine of the island with close to 200 warships and 8 aircraft carriers deployed into the Caribbean. Soviet ships en route to Cuba were stopped by U.S. naval vessels, while Soviet submarines were forced to surface and turn around. Meanwhile, Kennedy opened a secret diplomatic channel to Khrushchev, who admitted the Soviets had already installed enough missiles to destroy New York, Chicago, and other huge industrial cities, not to mention a little village like Washington. During back-channel diplomatic discussions, Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles in Cuba if Kennedy would remove U.S. missiles in Turkey, where they were pointed at the Soviet Union, thus taking a side deal that thus striking a side deal that would be hidden from the American public for 25 years. Khrushchev also wanted an assurance that the United States would not invade Cuba either directly or through proxies, the proxies being the CIA trained exiles. It would be foolish to expect the inevitable second invasion, said Khrushchev, to be as badly planned and as badly executed as the first. Kennedy, desperate to avoid a nuclear holocaust, agreed to Khrushchev's demands, frustrating members of NATO, who viewed Kennedy as a Chamberlain. The CIA was especially furious over Kennedy's second failure to liberate Cuba, and the Pentagon felt he had missed the big bus by not using the crisis as an excuse to invade the island. Once again, as the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban exiles suffered the most. They had not only lost this ideal opportunity to reclaim their homeland, but Kennedy in order to live up to his promise to Khrushchev to forego a second invasion, terminated CIA financial support to the exiles and ordered a halt to any raids or sabotage missions conducted from U.S. soil. On orders from the White House, via the Justice Department, the FBI began raiding training camps, confiscating weapons, and charging the exiles with criminal offenses. In a startling overnight shift, the exiles had gone from the universal mascots of liberty to criminal targets of the Kennedy administration. Many believe that Kennedy was being harder on the exiles than he was on Khrushchev and Castro, both of whom he was getting closer with through secret correspondences that bypassed the normal intelligence channels. To be sure, Kennedy's motives were patriotic and inspired by the desire for a peaceful world, but the intelligence community did not want a young president who had already erred twice, exchanging love letters with a red czar. In light of Kennedy's recent change of heart, a growing number of Cuban fanaticos became convinced that only one development could hasten the return of their beloved island. If an inspired act of God should place the White House within weeks, a Texan known to be a friend of all Latin Americans, Kennedy's Vice President Lyndon Johnson was from Texas, and an explanation is required as to why he seemed preferable to Kennedy. There's still a little more to go in this chapter, but we'll pick it up there. Maybe on Sunday. I think Sunday. Because I think even if my sister is here, I could still read it. I don't think they'll be here on Sunday, but we'll see. We'll see. I was just thinking, like, if that happened now, hi guys. I like. I want to say like, oh, because like Trump is in office, but that's just with whoever was in office. I just feel like, especially if you live in Florida, but or even Arthur, you in Louisiana. I just feel like you'd be like, shut this down. We consider it an act of hostility if you're accepting hundreds of nuclear warheads. So, I gotta bring the barrels in. This is the plan that my sister's coming Saturday, that one of the women is coming tomorrow. I think it's just her, which would be ideal because she can be on the couch. And she'll probably be here tomorrow night, which is why I can't probably be streaming tomorrow night because I'll have her here. And then um I don't know how many days, if it's even just gonna be Friday, tomorrow, and then she'll leave Saturday, or if she'll be another day. I don't know, but I will try and give you an update tomorrow on OF. Um, this is all I know right now. Like even my updates change like uh during the show, like as things go on. So that's all I know right now. But so don't expect tomorrow. Um, but that's okay. We'll have some fun next Friday. I'm doing things that have to get done. I'm trying. Um, all right, get some rest. Let's see who went home on Big Brother. Don't spoil it. Oh, thank you, Jerry. I love you so much. Okay.